to anyone listening to this as well, particularly the financial service profession, we all get hung up a little bit on qualifications. And there's lots of evidence to show that clients actually don't give a monkeys what qualifications we have. And, don't get me wrong, even 2 years ago, I still did all my pension transfer qualifications. I still continue down the regulated routes. But in the last 3 years, I've done an immense amount of personal development work. I've done a financial coaching qualification in the UK. I am currently halfway through another financial coaching qualification in the US. I've been exploring financial therapy. I've been exploring financial psychology, and I'm currently in a master's circle of other financial psychologists globally.
Welcome to episode 29 of the Innovating Advice Show. I'm joined by Catherine Morgan, an award-winning financial coach and founder of the Money Panel in the UK. In this episode, Catherine recounts a traumatic experience when her second son was an infant and shares how that trauma ended up playing a big role in her career trajectory and what she's built at the Money Panel. She also shares 2 new projects at the end, the Initiative for Financial Wellbeing and an online coaching course she's created for financial advisors. Links to everything we mention and show notes are at innovatingadvice.com/episode 29. You're listening to the Innovating Advice Show, and I'm your host, Kate Holmes, bringing you the global pulse on financial services innovation, featuring financial planners, financial advisors, and related professionals from all corners of the globe. Let's dive in. Hey, Catherine, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So, Catherine, I love your story. And what I love most about your story is how open you are about the bumps and struggles that you've had along the way, many of which you even share openly on your website, and how you've channeled all of those experiences into creating so much good for both your clients and other colleagues in this profession. And I really want to start with when you went back to work, you were working part-time at a bank after your second son was born, and you had a lot going on in your life. So can we start with having you share what you were going through personally at that time, and also how you were feeling about your work?
Yeah, sure. So I had two boys. The first one I had sort of 2.5 years apart, and when I had my first son, I was working as a sales manager over in the Channel Islands, which is a little island off the coast of the UK. And beautiful place. We got married over there, beautiful, beautiful island. And then when I came back from maternity leave the first time round, I couldn't really operate as a sales manager. The bank wouldn't allow me to do it part-time. So I actually came back as a financial advisor. And then we moved back from Jersey to the UK. And then within a year, I fell pregnant with my second child. And when I had Thomas, my second son, we had some pretty significant health issues with Thomas when he was born. So to put it into kind of perspective a little bit, when I had my first son, he was delivered by emergency C-section, and I was knocked out. I wasn't even awake when he was delivered. Wow. So when I had my second son, I was so determined to be awake for the birth of my son, which I know I know, it's a big thing, but for me, it was really important. And so in the lead up to before he was born, I was physically struggling quite a lot to do my job whilst be pregnant, because I had a condition called SPD, which is all to do with your pelvic sort of how the body develops when you're pregnant. And I was basically on crutches, and it was very, very in a lot of pain. So my job was quite challenging, but I still remained in work. And after Thomas was born, I was awake when I had him. It was a normal delivery. It was all very lovely and wonderful, as having a child is. But unfortunately, after 3 days after he was born, he was starting to show signs of not being particularly well. Now, we didn't really understand what, even though it was our second child, we didn't really understand what the challenges were. But we then later found out when we took him into hospital, he wasn't feeding properly. He was sleeping for really long, extended hours. And we were thinking, yes, we've got a sleeper. This is great. But actually, what unfolded was when he was 3 days old, we ended up in hospital with him, and we were told there was a 50-50 chance that he was actually going to survive through the night. Oh. And so we ended up in hospital with him for a week. He was pumped with antibiotics, and we never actually really found out what was wrong with him. He just had an infection, and he was treated, and then I came home with him. But then fast forward to 5 weeks, he was 5 weeks old. He had a particularly disturbed night's sleep. And on one particular morning, it was the 1st of October, 2013. I remember it literally as clear as day. And he had a particularly disturbed night's sleep, didn't really want to feed, but didn't know what to do with himself. And he was kind of grunting in his sleep, making a really odd noise. And we kind of just thought it was a bit cute. Like, we thought it was just like one of these little personality things.
Yeah.
And we woke up that morning, continued to get ready for the day. I took my son to nursery, and my husband went off to work. And my friend was coming over for the day to have some baby hand casting sessions done, where you put the baby's hands and feet into clay and it, leaves these lovely imprints. And my friend came round and with her baby, and her baby put his hands in the clay, and then it was my turn to go and get Thomas out of the Moses basket. Now, this was like at 11 o'clock in the morning. So by that point, we'd had a few hours of him being really distressed, didn't want to feed, didn't want to sleep, didn't want to do anything, but clearly didn't want to be touched. And so I left him in the Moses basket in the end. I potted around, he fell asleep, and I just thought, okay, he's having his morning nap. And then when it was my time to take him out of the Moses basket, I walked over to the bay window and I picked him up out of the Moses basket, and he had a baby grow on with his hands covered and his feet covered. And I unwrapped his baby grow off his hands so that I could put it into the clay. And he just screamed blue murder at me, didn't want to be held. And it wasn't even like a pain cry. It was just I can't even describe it, just a really unusual cry. And I remember turning to my friend and saying, something's not right with him. I think I'm going to book a doctor's appointment. And so I quickly did this hand casting, and I noticed that his hands were freezing cold, and so were his feet. And I remember thinking, well, it is the 1st of October. It's pretty cold, but the heating's on. So that's really strange. It didn't have a temperature. It wasn't hot to touch. So I put him back in the Moses basket, and I said to my friend, do you mind leaving early? Because I just really want to get him checked by a doctor. And obviously, having nearly lost him at a few days old, we were quite sensitive, I guess, to his health. And so I booked a doctor's appointment, and I was texting my friend who's a nurse, and I said, look, am I being a paranoid mum here? Like, he's not feeding, he's sleeping all the time, he doesn't want to be picked up, and his hands are really cold. And she said, well, have you checked his temperature? And I thought, well, no, I haven't, because he's cold. It doesn't appear to be hot.
Yeah.
So I checked his temperature, and his temperature was like 39.8, which for anyone who has children, anything that's over like 37 over here, it's like, get the Calpol out, like get the paracetamol out. So I bunged him straight into the car seat. I rang my husband and I said, meet me down at A&E. I'm not taking any chances. And within 20 minutes of arriving at the hospital, literally it was life or death situation. Thomas's situation, his kind of condition just deteriorated rapidly, really, really quickly. And I'll never forget the moment I was sitting in A&E, in the children's A&E department, who were absolutely fantastic. And I took him out of the car seat. He wasn't doing anything at this point. He wasn't crying. He wasn't doing anything. And I had him in my arms, and they put me on a wheelchair and they wheeled me down. And I remember just going underneath resuscitation. And I remember thinking, oh, this is quite serious. And within minutes, all of these doctors and junior doctors and nurses all swarmed around the bed. There must be about 15 people around us. And this one particular doctor kept using this word sepsis. And I remember thinking, well, I think I know what sepsis is, but I'm not 100% sure what it means. Obviously, frantically later Googling it, which is like the worst thing you can do, but everybody does it, right? I think you can self-diagnose pretty much anything on Google nowadays. And then I realized it was septicemia. But what we didn't realize is until 3 days after that, after a series of tests and lumbar punctures and some awful things that he had to go through, was that it was the early signs of sepsis, which was then diagnosed. He was then diagnosed with bacterial meningitis, which is the worst form of meningitis. This is the one that needs urgent treatment. Otherwise, it's an inflammation of the brain, and it can leave some quite severe consequences and can actually lead to death very quickly. Now, I didn't know as a mum that sepsis was the biggest killer of newborn babies. I didn't know that the symptoms of sepsis were cold hands and cold feet and grunting in their sleep. I didn't know that. And I felt really stupid as a mum. I felt like I should have known that. Why didn't I know this? And subsequently, when I went back to work at the bank a year later, I had a pretty terrible personal kind of acceptance of what had happened, because whilst it was going on, I was absolutely fine. Like, I was in solution mode, being a financial planner, I was in solution mode. I knew what the outcome was. I knew that he needed medication. But when I went back to work, I was then diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I actually went into a deep spiral of anxiety because I tried to control everything. And the reason I tried to control everything was because every time I heard Thomas cry when he came out of hospital, it reminded me of one time in hospital when this doctor walked into the room to give Thomas his antibiotic medication. And Thomas was in my arms at the time. And this doctor just walked straight over. No, hello, how are you? No bedside manner. Walked straight into my room. I was in like a private room with Thomas. And walked over to Thomas and started to flush through his cannula, which is what they had to do in order to administer the medication. And he just started pushing this needle into Thomas's cannula. And I kept saying to the doctor, it's not in the right place, it's slipping out. And Thomas just started screaming. And I mean like a cry scream, like, you just recognize that scream, it's a pain cry. And this doctor just completely ignored me and said, no, we need to keep pushing, because if this comes out of this particular vein, we have to use veins in his head or in his feet. And I was like, oh my God, I don't want that to happen. So he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And Thomas is screaming and screaming and screaming. And after what felt like about 20 minutes, the doctor eventually removed the cannula and said, oh, it's slipping out. We need to put a new one in. And I was like, yes, I've been saying this to you for 20 minutes. But that one particular moment of Thomas crying and I couldn't do anything to help him, I felt so out of control, combined with all the jargon that the doctors were using with me that I didn't understand and made me feel stupid. Those two things combined, when I went back to work, I sat there and thought, do you know what? How many people feel like this around money?
Wow.
How many people don't understand money because no one's ever taught them? And it really just completely changed my life. And I thought, I'm working in an environment where I'm targeted on products. But not everybody needs products. Yeah. Sometimes people just need to improve their relationship with money, how they feel about money, the underlying emotion. The underlying emotion for me was anxiety. When I was anxious about what was going on and I couldn't control it, I then went into a place of not making great decisions. So all of that experience just completely changed the way that I operated and the work that I was doing in the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a powerful story. And thank goodness Thomas is okay now. He's a healthy boy and gets out and exercises. But what a thing to go through. And of course that would give anybody anxiety and struggles. But you found a way, like I said earlier, to turn all those challenges into good. And it started with that light bulb moment of thinking, and you're right, a lot of people do feel that way. And that's long been a challenge that advisors and planners have. And I don't blame consumers for not working with a lot of advisors, because there is tremendous jargon used. And even in my early days of being an advisor, I used to always meet with wholesalers, and they would come in and talk about their products. I had no idea what they were talking about. And I also had a feeling that I kind of didn't care, right? They weren't talking about things that were important. They weren't talking about how it really solves a problem. They were just using all these big words. And so you kind of took the natural course from there, from working the bank, to think, okay, well, I'm going to go work for an IFA and I'm going to, get out of the big bank environment. And so how did that go?
Yeah. So for me, when I went back to work, I felt this big disconnect. I felt suddenly, and I always kind of felt like this, but it was just magnified at that time. You know what it's like, where you're kind of, the great thing about being in a bank is that, you're paid well. And actually that fueled I had a really negative relationship with money growing up, way before my son was born. And in my 20s and in my teenage years, I had lots of eating disorders. I was bullied at school. And lots of other things that happened in my childhood, which actually led me to have a really bad relationship with money. So even working in the bank as a financial advisor, telling everybody else what they should be doing, I wasn't doing it for myself. And now I've come on to learn much more about why that's the case. But for me, it kind of, the fact that I was earning good money was fueling that kind of shopping habit, so to speak. And for me, I got to this disconnect where I felt like I was coming out of meetings with clients and really helping them understand, come out with a better outcome, understanding their paperwork, for example. I remember the days of like going to little old ladies' houses, and all of their share paperwork would cover their lounge floors. And, maybe they'd lost their spouse when they'd never, ever dealt with money ever before, because it was always the husband that did everything. And it wasn't until the 1960s in this country that a woman was even legally allowed to open a bank account. Like, that's just nuts. And so historically and generationally, that generation that I was looking after, typically retired clients, they didn't need more financial products. They had the financial products. They might needed a few tweaking here and there and some inheritance tax planning, but actually they just needed to understand money and what they had and whether it was enough. And so I'd come out of these meetings and my boss would like hammer me over the head, like, where's your product sale? And I'd be like, well, they didn't need a product. And I just felt this big disconnect between, it's not just about products. It's about managing people and managing humans and helping them to manage their own relationship with money rather than just products.
Yeah.
So I thought, I kind of sat there thinking, this was in 2016, so 3 years after my youngest was born. I sat there thinking, surely it must be better in the independent space. Surely, it's got to be better. And I was hearing lots of better, good stories about the independent market. So I got to 2016 and I resigned. I had a conversation with a couple of local practices to me, and it was very clear that it was easy to get work on a consultancy basis. So at that time, I actually had a sideline business at the time, which was personal styling. I had a personal styling business, and I thought, I'm just going to give up this work in financial services. I'm going to run this personal styling business. I'm going to empower women to feel better about their bodies, which is a separate story, because that changed my life. Absolutely. Yeah. I had a personal styling day in Jersey in the Channel Islands when I was 27, and it changed my life. And it was the start of my journey to improving my relationship with money, is understanding that I was using money as a tool to fill a void in my life. And those things combined gave me passion to do something different. And I was so disillusioned with the bank. I thought, right, I'm going to go into the independent market on a self-employed contractor basis, work 3 days a week. So work how many hours I want to work, not what people are telling me I should do or am allowed to do. And oh my goodness, I was completely bowled over with, it was actually worse than working at the bank, because in the bank, everything had governance and structure and guidelines and compliance. And in the independent space, it was like, what's compliance? Like, what's a suitability report? It was just shocking. And it didn't really matter which IFA firm I spoke with. Some were better than others. But the focus was still on products.
Yeah,
and it wasn't
run a bit like the wild, wild west.
It felt like that very much. And I eventually did find a practice that was more forward thinking. And actually the guy who ran it was a guy I used to work with years before that. And he was very much wanting to get into the space of financial planning. And I never really understood that financial planning even existed. And it wasn't until I started to research about the principles of financial coaching and financial planning that I then discovered an incredible UK community over here called the NextGen Planners. So I had a conversation with Adam and I said, look, I'm either going to leave the profession or I'm going to emigrate to Australia, because that was my choice at the time. I was like, I either leave or I go and join my dad and my brother out in Australia. And he was like, well, come in under my wing. I'll look after you and let me share with you everything there is to do about financial planning. And he actually coached me. He'd done a coaching qualification. He needed a guinea pig. And so I volunteered, and literally that changed the whole course of my profession. I always thank Adam for that work, because it was just at the right time for me. And I really then started to open my eyes out to this whole concept of financial coaching, financial planning, financial therapy, and lifestyle financial planning. And that for me just changed everything.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Adam is who suggested you to be on the podcast. So shout out and thank you to Adam. He is fantastic. And the work that he and Rohan are doing with NextGen Planners in the UK is awesome. And so you kind of went down this path, and I've been there too, thinking, do I just leave the profession? Getting a bit disillusioned and frustrated that it was so product focused and not feeling like you're having the impact on people that you want to have and you know that you can have. So huge credit to Adam for coaching you and to you for being open to go through that process, because the easy thing might have been just to leave and go to Australia, which is my favorite place in the world. So that's probably what I would have done. But you stuck with it and you decided to embrace that entrepreneurial side that you have. Your dad is an entrepreneur. You had started some other businesses while you were at the bank, and you thought, okay, I'm just going to start my own thing. And you were told the same thing I was when I was like, I'm going to start something totally different. Person after person said, don't do that. You won't make any money.
Yeah. And still now, actually, there's a lot of more traditional financial advisors, should we say, that still have this belief that you can't make money from financial coaching. Yeah. And yes, there are some financial coaches out there that, that don't charge anything sometimes for their services. And we have to be very careful about that, actually. A lot of giving professions like therapists or coaches, because they want to help people, they actually have a lot of money blocks themselves, ironically, which can then lead them to not charging for their services. And that then gives this kind of feel that financial coaching isn't valuable, and that's not the case at all. So we have to be careful about that. But from a financial coaching perspective, the opportunity there is incredible to be able to change people's lives. But I think for me, that work really was just about focusing on the client and changing the client's relationship with money rather than just focusing on products.
Yeah. So you ended up starting the money panel, and you kind of have learned and talk about how the brain works, trauma and the effects on money, managing emotions first. What kind of training did you go through to understand all that, in addition to just your own life experience? Because sometimes that's the very best training you can do, is just what you've gone through yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say, like, to anyone listening to this as well, like, particularly the financial service profession, we all get hung up a little bit on qualifications.
Yep.
And there's lots of evidence to show that clients actually don't give a monkeys what qualifications we have. And, don't get me wrong, I've, even 2 years ago, I'd still did all my pension transfer qualifications. I still continue down the regulated routes. But in the last 3 years, I've done an immense work, an immense amount of personal development work. I've done a financial coaching qualification in the UK. I am currently halfway through another financial coaching qualification in the US. I've been exploring financial therapy. I've been exploring financial psychology, and I'm currently in a master's circle of other financial psychologists globally. So I'm getting involved and interested in things that interest me, some of which will lead to qualifications, some won't. I'm also NLP qualified. I did an NLP certification as well this year. So some of it, I think, is important to have qualifications, but most of it, I would say, comes from my own personal experiences and even reading. I mean, there's so many great books that can give you such valuable information that you can then use with your clients and just start practicing. But there is a real skill with coaching. One of the big parts of financial coaching is about your ability to be able to listen and really listen. And that's the skill and the challenge for a lot of financial advisors and planners, is that we're so used to getting into the solution mode, because that's what clients come to us for. Or that's what we think clients come to us for, but sometimes they just want to be listened to. And that's the real, I would say, probably the most difficult challenge for me, is moving from that skill of having to be the person coming up with a solution to actually holding the space for a client, for them to actually come up with their own solution. Because the work as a financial coach is both practical and emotional. And you can't tell a client how to feel. You can't tell them how they should feel or do differently. They have to change that work within internally first, before potentially we then come in with a little kit bag of, here are some of the external practical things that you can do. But they've got to work on the emotional relationship with themselves first. And that's down to you empowering them rather than you telling them what to do.
Well, and that solves one of the biggest problems that planners are always talking about, is how do you get clients to actually implement the advice you give? And I think that's one of the challenges we see, is that so often it's just planners saying, here's an 80, 100, 300 page notebook telling you all the things that you need to fix and change. Now go do it. Like that's not going to get buy-in, and that's not getting down to those deeper issues of, what is stopping you from taking this action? And is this actually the action that you should be taking? Is this going to set you on the path that you truly want deep down?
Yeah, absolutely. You just summarized that beautifully, because that is a challenge. Sometimes we can say to a client, like, go and gift some of your wealth away, because otherwise it's going to be, it's going to fall into the hands of inheritance tax. And they're like, yeah, they sit there and nod. Yeah, I'll do that. And then you see them a year later, and then you ask them, did you go and do that? Oh, no, I didn't. And it's because you've come up with that solution, and actually we haven't got down to the deep beliefs, their subconscious beliefs, which actually have probably been there for their entire life. And we know that from a psychological perspective, we make 90% of our decisions from our subconscious belief system. And if that subconscious belief system is not just your beliefs from, that have been inherited potentially from your parents and your environment and your school and social media influence and all of these things and religion, but also how much of our beliefs have come through their parents and their parents, like generationally. There's some amazing books around this subject, actually. One I've just finished reading called It Didn't Start With You, and by Mark Woolman. And in that book, he talks about how a lot of the patterns of behaviors actually don't even come from us. They come from grandparents and even right back further through the generations. And I was having a conversation with my mum about this, because I've always had a very negative relationship with my body. And I always put it down to the fact that I was bullied at school. That's just what I put it down to. And the fact that then my dad emigrated to Australia when I was 15, I found that very difficult. And then my brother emigrated to Australia a year later. I always put it down to those situations. And I'm sure that contributed towards it. But actually, when I look back through the generations and the financial blueprints, my mum's dad was in the Shangi Japanese prisoner of war camps in the Second World War. Wow. And he survived. But he came out, like a skeleton, weighing 5.5 stone. And before he went into the prisoner of war camps, his favourite pudding was rice pudding. And so his wife, my nan, who's still alive now, she's like 94, my mum's mum, she made him rice pudding when he came out of the camps, and he didn't eat it because he'd lived on rice for like however many years he was in the prisoner of war camps for. Yeah. And he unfortunately did pass away at the age of 50 odd from a heart attack. And we believe that was likely to be because of the stress caused on his, physically on his heart. So my mum was 13 when she lost her dad. And she always struggles, and still now struggles, obviously, with the loss of her, a very important person in her life. Now, I was 13 when I developed an eating disorders. And what this book goes on to talk about is how actually I wonder whether I'm actually carrying that trauma from my mum, and that's being passed through to me, because, scientifically, when my mum was pregnant and I was in the womb, that trauma would have been carried through her and through into us when she created us. And therefore, there's lots of evidence to show that trauma is actually carried through the generations. And I just think that's really, whether it's true or not, like it's so interesting to then start to question. So therefore, the beliefs that I hold about money, are they even true? Did I give them to myself, or were they given to me from somebody else?
Yeah. And can you still take action? And now that you understand that, then take that understanding and change your relationship with money.
And that's it, isn't it? It's bringing awareness to that. That's the first step, is bringing awareness and curiosity to that. And if we can do that as a financial planner, as an advisor, is to bring some curiosity and have these conversations with our clients. We don't have to be financial therapists to be able to do this, but just to have those kind of questions about, what was your experience with money growing up? What was your partner's experience with money growing up? If there's maybe some financial conflict when you're building them a plan, and like Mr. saying, like, yes, it's really important that we gift money away, but yet you can kind of see from the body language that maybe the other person's like, no, I want to protect all this money for ourselves. Like that happens a lot, right? Because there's two conflicting values there going on. And if you can observe that through their body language, through their language, through conversations, then you can actually have a conversation with them about that and understand why maybe one of them is going into hoarding mode and one of them is perhaps the complete opposite of that, because that's what causes a lot of financial conflict. It's a conflict of values.
Oh, absolutely. And I would imagine in order to do that properly, you would need to go through that, just as you go through that yourself. rather than just kind of seeing it in other people, it really only has the impact if you've done that work internally.
Yeah, and that's why literally just in the last few weeks, we've just launched out into the market a new financial coaching program for advisors and planners, because we want them to go through that themselves in a gentle way and in a very supported way in groups. And it's all done online, so we can go into breakout groups. But that actually being able to go through that yourself, because you will have your own biases. So as an advisor, if you don't understand your own relationship to money, then that's going to have an impact on your clients. So actually, the advisors will go through a whole change process themselves, and then they can use that to, and we'll give them tools and exercises they can do to then use that with their client work.
That's great. And that just launched, I think it was just like a week or so ago, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. So it's a coaching program so that advisors go through that? Does it also teach them how to then coach their clients?
Yeah, so it's a 90-day program. So over 12 weeks, every other week, we have a call on Zoom for 2 hours every 2 weeks. And we take a subject area. So we basically take them all the way through from how the brain works, all the way through to using tools to help them understand their relationship with money. And they'll go off and do little bits of homework after each session, some of which involve games, some exercises, and just some thoughts, reflections. And then the idea is that over the 12 weeks is that they get an opportunity to practice on themselves and with others, to the point where they're willing to share. Sometimes, we're not ready to share that information. That's absolutely fine. They don't have to do that. But the idea is that by the end of it, not only have they thought about their own relationship with money, and actually sometimes we get some incredibly life-changing results for the people going through these programs themselves, but then give them an opportunity to practice some of the exercises and tools that I've been using in my business for the last few years to then help to get their clients thinking differently, behaving differently, and acting differently with money.
That's great. And is that only available for advisors in the UK, or is it something that advisors around the world could participate in?
Yeah, no, we've just had somebody inquire actually from Australia. So yeah, very welcome to have, it would be wonderful to have some global exposure, and actually interesting as well from a social perspective to understand the differences socially between different countries. And I think it'll be a wonderful place. So yeah, it's all online. So there's no geographical constraints nowadays, particularly with, as we're recording this right now with the coronavirus, we're giving people an opportunity to dip into 2 different slots, so they can either have an afternoon session in the UK, or there's also an evening session. So if people are coming in from Australia or the US, then actually the evening session for us in the UK is kind of like a morning session for America and Australia. So it allows that global access.
Perfect. And I've linked to that down in the show notes, so you can link directly to it and it'll take you there. And I want to circle back to what you've built at the Money Panel. And one of the things I've been talking with advisors around the world as they're looking at how do they innovate in their practice and how do they start to introduce different ways of connecting with clients, especially working with sort of next gen younger clients. And Catherine, you've done it all. You've got a podcast, you've got a Facebook community, you've got online courses, you've got this all-female community called the Money Circle, you've got a book that you did. I know you're working on a lot of other projects. So you've gone through sort of all the different great ways that you can reach out to your audience, connect, build that brand, and provide a ton of value. So what advice would you have to advisors that are thinking of starting something like you've built or going down some of those paths? How do you decide where to focus first?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm a huge believer in focusing on what you're passionate about and just get started. One of the hardest things I found was that, like when you want to start a podcast, for example, and you're listening to an existing podcast, you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. It sounds amazing. The whole production looks amazing. And you're like, how? I can't understand the tech. And you just go into overwhelm. Yeah. And when we get into overwhelm, we don't make decisions. So for me, it's about the next best step. So what is the next best step for your business? And that may be a membership. It might be an online course. It might be running webinars. It might be launching a podcast. For me, podcasting is great because we know that statistically, people are much more engaged with podcasting right now. We know that people listen to 100% of a podcast interview in comparison to just 20% of a Facebook Live, for example. So you're going to get more traction. Also, podcasting, you don't have to show your face. So it's like there's this massive imposter syndrome fear of, oh my God, I don't want to do a Facebook Live because I don't want to show my face. So podcasting is great because you can just talk. And actually, I didn't start podcasting. I started radio show. I actually was having coffee with a bunch of solicitors because I thought I was going to go down the whole divorce routes with financial planning. And so I was having this lunch with these solicitors, and one of them turned around to me and said, "You would be great on radio." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And I went home that night, and she gave me this email address for the local radio show. And I emailed the producer with like a pitch. And I said, "Look, this is the show I want to bring to you. I think there's a gap at the moment." And he just emailed me back that night and said, "Yes, please. When can we have a meeting?" And I was like, "Oh my God." So, and then I ran this radio show for about 6 months. And then that gave me the confidence with like the whole production of then podcasting. And it was the best decision I ever made. So, but it didn't start, it had to start with taking action. So it had to start with just the first baby step. And I would say for anyone thinking about doing any of those things, just think about what are you motivated to do the most? Because that's the one you're likely to want to do. And what's the first step? Is it learning how to run a podcast, buying a course on it, or watching some YouTube videos, or speaking with an existing podcaster?
Yeah.
Just think about the first step, then what's the second step, then what's the third step. And then all of a sudden, everything is less overwhelming and you're in a position of empowerment and control.
That's perfect. And giving it time, because especially if you're like building a Facebook community, that isn't going to happen overnight. And you're not going to have thousands of people in there. If you start one today, 4 days from now, it's not going to be a booming success. So that gets to your point of doing something that you're passionate about, because if you don't, because it takes a while to get traction, then you're going to end up probably just, throwing it by the wayside. And it gets back to everything we've been talking about in terms of your relationship to money. It can be the same thing as your relationship to goals. What's holding you back? What's your story with getting to that next best thing?
Yeah, it's purpose and passion, isn't it? And for me, I've never thought about how much money can I make from this. I think about impact. Yeah, and actually, I was interviewing somebody on my podcast today about numerology, and apparently my life path number is a number 22, which is all about impact. So it's really interesting for me to think about, as long as I make decisions that are based on impact, the impact I can have on other people's lives, then any decision I make is going to be the right decision. And sometimes it's just, you get started, get perfect later, and just try. Like sometimes it doesn't work and you think, oh, okay, I'm not really enjoying that, and I'll just stop. But when you're building content, you're putting content out to your audience, it is about the value of that content you're providing and how you can delight your clients. Building community is a really important thing. And that's what the NextGen Planners over in the UK have demonstrated beautifully. It's all about the power of building communities. So for me, I was almost like taking this humanitarian perspective of how can I go and build a community, a tribe of people who just enjoy listening to me and maybe have a similar relationship to money, because I know then that they're going to be attracted to my story.
Yeah, that's great. And speaking of impact, we've got a couple minutes left. Share with us what the initiative for financial well-being is all about.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the Initiative for Financial Wellbeing was formed last year, so 2019, and it was actually headed up. It was all being driven by somebody called Chris Budd. Chris Budd is an author over here. He's written 2 books, actually, one called The Eternal Business and one about financial wellbeing. And actually, Chris always says that he actually came up with the whole concept of financial well-being. When he originally wrote his book, it didn't exist, and now everyone seems to be jumping on the bandwagon of financial well-being. But Chris had this real motivator to help the industry to focus, from a financial planners or advisor perspective, to help them to focus on improving their clients' happiness rather than just being wealthier, being happier. And when Chris told me about this project, I was like, yep, I'm in, like 100% aligns to everything I believe in with my business. And then a whole bunch of other people were like, yes, like we'd love to get involved with that. And we just started, a bit like what I was saying earlier. We just got started, and now we've got, I think, close to over 200 members. And we're now in the process of developing that initiative so that we can bring a series of tools, research materials, some contents, some events, partnerships with organizations that are very focused on really what financial well-being is all about. I know there's lots of people that talk about financial well-being when actually underneath it, it's just product sales.
Yep.
This is about true financial happiness. How do we help clients to be happier and not just wealthier?
That's awesome. And I'm linking to that in the show notes, and Catherine linking to your website because you've done a fantastic job with branding, linking to your podcast, In Her Financial Shoes, which I just think is awesome. Your Facebook community, so advisors can see how you've built that out and really just what you've done. And like I said earlier, how you've taken everything that you've gone through, you've turned it into so many wonderful things, and all the ways that you're reaching people, that you're impacting clients out there, prospects, probably hundreds or thousands of people that you're never even going to hear from, but your story and what you're sharing and the value that you're putting out there is impacting them. And through work like the coaching course, the Initiative for Financial Wellbeing, what you're doing to help propel this profession forward. So Catherine, thank you so much for your time today, for what you're doing. And I very much look forward to keeping in touch and having you on the show again as you continue to develop all these great resources.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for taking the opportunity to let me share my story with your listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Innovating Advice Show. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn and shoot me a thought or two. Link to my profile is right below. Stay safe, stay well, and I look forward to hearing from you.